Prayer is not just something we do to make ourselves feel better. It is the channel through which heaven touches earth. It is the way God's power enters human problems. Every time you kneel in prayer, you're opening a doorway between the natural and the supernatural. It's easy to forget that behind the visible world, there's an invisible realm, one where spiritual forces are constantly at work. When you pray, you're not sending empty words into the air, you're inviting the creator of the universe to step into the details of your life. You're saying, God, I can't handle this, but you can. And that invitation changes everything. There are times when we face battles too great for our strength. Moments when the darkness feels thicker than ever, when our emotions are exhausted and our minds can't figure out the next step. It's in those times that prayer becomes more than words. It becomes a lifeline. You might feel powerless, but when you pray, you are never helpless. You are connecting to the one whose power knows no limits, whose wisdom never fails, and whose love never runs dry. Prayer doesn't always change your situation instantly, but it does shift the atmosphere. It moves things in the unseen realm before they manifest in the seen. Imagine standing in a room that's completely dark. You can stumble, you can panic, or you can reach for the switch. Prayer is that switch. When you turn it on, light begins to chase away the darkness. Not because you created the light, but because you invited it in. God is the source of that light, and prayer is the way you make room for him to shine through. When you stop praying, you close the window through which his light pours in. That's why the enemy loves distraction, doubt, and discouragement. Because if he can stop you from praying, he can keep you from accessing your power. Prayer is heaven's response system to earth's distress signals. It's how you call for reinforcements when the battle grows fierce. When you pray, angels are dispatched, hearts are softened, doors begin to open, and strength begins to rise inside you. You may not see it immediately, but something starts shifting the moment you pray. You are never talking to the ceiling, you are talking to the King who reigns above it all. The Bible says, the effective, fervent prayer of the righteous availeth much. That means when you pray with faith and persistence, your prayer releases energy into situations that look lifeless. So when life seems overwhelming, when your finances are tight, your relationships are strained, or your future feels uncertain, don't shut down, look up. Your strength might be limited, but your prayer gives you access to an unlimited source. You might not have control over every outcome, but you have a direct line to the one who does. Prayer is the bridge that takes you from your weakness to God's strength, from your confusion to his clarity, from your fear to his peace. Every time you pray, you're making a declaration that you trust God's power more than your own, that you believe his light can conquer any darkness. The world may say, do something, but sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is pray. Because prayer doesn't waste time. It redeems it. It gathers heaven's attention and releases divine resources to where they are needed most. It's not about fancy words or long speeches. It's about a sincere heart that says, God, I need you here. So don't underestimate what happens when you pray. The atmosphere shifts. Heaven listens. Power flows. And little by little, the darkness begins to retreat. Not because you fought harder, but because you prayed stronger. The enemy doesn't tremble when you plan, argue, or post your frustrations. He trembles when you pray. That's because prayer connects you directly to the one who already defeated him. Darkness has no fear of human strength, but it fears divine authority. And that authority is released when a believer prays with faith. You can spend your whole life trying to fight spiritual battles in your own power, but until you kneel in prayer, you're swinging at shadows. The moment you pray, the fight shifts. It's no longer about your ability, it's about God's supremacy. Prayer moves the battle from your hands into His, and that's when the enemy knows he's outmatched. When you pray, you step onto sacred ground. You remind the enemy of his defeat. You remind him of the blood that was shed, the victory that was sealed, and the authority that was handed to you through faith. That's why he tries so hard to keep you silent. He knows that the moment you begin to pray, his schemes start to unravel. He'll fill your mind with distractions, your heart with doubt, and your life with noise. Anything to keep you from that sacred conversation with God, because he knows prayer weakens his grip and strengthens your spirit. The enemy loves to attack when you're tired, when you feel unseen, or when your faith is fading. That's when prayer becomes your shield. Every whispered prayer is like a declaration of war against the darkness. When you say, "Lord, I trust you," you're not just speaking words. You're taking ground in the spiritual realm. You're letting the enemy know that he doesn't have the final say over your life, your family, or your future. The devil fears a praying believer because prayer is proof that no matter what he throws at you, you're still connected to your source. He can't stop God from blessing you, so he tries to stop you from praying. He can't block heaven's answers, so he tries to block your faith. That's why it's not unusual for your greatest temptations, your biggest distractions, and your deepest discouragements to show up right when you decide to pray. But that's also your cue that something powerful is about to happen. Because prayer shakes the unseen world. It pushes back the darkness that tries to whisper, "You're alone," and replaces it with the truth that you're never abandoned. When you pray, you're not begging for victory. You're enforcing it. You're reminding the enemy that his time is limited and his power is temporary. The victory was already secured long before your problem began. Prayer simply activates that victory in your situation. It's not about eloquence or volume. It's about faith. Even the softest cry of a believer carries more authority than the loudest roar of the enemy. Prayer turns ordinary people into spiritual warriors, people who don't back down because they know who stands with them. Sometimes you won't see the result right away, and that's when persistence becomes your weapon. The enemy hopes you'll give up when you don't get instant answers, but real prayer digs in deeper. It says, "I'll keep praying until I see the breakthrough." And every time you do, you're tearing down strongholds brick by brick. Even when it feels like nothing's happening, your prayers are stirring heaven's response and frustrating hell's agenda. So don't underestimate the power that rises when you pray. Every time you choose prayer over panic, faith over fear, and worship over worry, you're doing something the enemy cannot stop. You're standing under divine covering. You're reminding darkness that it has boundaries. You're showing heaven that your trust is fixed. The enemy fears that kind of believer, the one who may be weary but still prays, who may be wounded but still worships, who may be waiting but still believes. Because as long as you're praying, you're winning. Life has a way of shaking us. One moment everything feels steady, and the next the ground beneath us begins to tremble. Fear creeps in. Worry fills the air. The unknown becomes louder than truth. That's when panic tries to take control. It whispers lies that God has forgotten, that you're on your own, that things will never change. But prayer silences those lies. Prayer doesn't remove every storm, but it changes how you stand in the middle of it. It transforms panic into peace, not by altering what's around you first, but by calming what's within you. When you pray, you shift your focus from what's falling apart to who still holds it together. You stop staring at the problem and start fixing your eyes on the promise. Prayer takes your attention off the noise of fear and tunes your heart to the voice of God. Fear tells you to run, but prayer teaches you to rest. Worry makes you restless, but prayer makes you still. It's not magic, it's alignment. You begin to see things differently when you pray because your heart starts to line up with heaven's perspective. You remember that no matter how strong the wind blows, you are anchored to a God who never moves. Peace doesn't come from pretending the problem isn't real. It comes from knowing that God is greater than the problem. When you pray, you hand over the burden that was never meant for you to carry. You trade anxiety for assurance. You trade stress for strength. It's a divine exchange that only happens in the quiet moments of surrender. The world teaches you to fight your panic by controlling your circumstances, but prayer teaches you to find peace by releasing them. Real control doesn't come from holding tighter. It comes from trusting deeper. Sometimes prayer doesn't change your situation immediately because God is using the waiting to grow your peace. You learn to breathe in faith when you pray consistently. You start realizing that even when you don't feel in control, God is still at work behind the scenes. That's what prayer reminds you. That his silence doesn't mean his absence, and his timing is never too late. Every whispered prayer strengthens your soul, quiets your fear, and restores your confidence in his goodness. There's something powerful that happens when you stop reacting in panic and start responding in prayer. Your tone changes. Your thoughts change. The same storm that once terrified you becomes an opportunity to experience God's presence in a deeper way. Panic says, "What if it all goes wrong?" Prayer says, "Even if it does, God will make it right." Peace isn't the absence of trouble, it's the presence of trust. When you pray, you're telling your soul to rest in the truth that you're not alone, that your situation doesn't define your future, and that God's hand is still guiding your steps. The world may call it foolish to pray when everything feels urgent, but faith knows that prayer is never wasted time. It's what keeps your heart steady while you wait for the storm to pass. It's what renews your strength when everything else is draining you. Sometimes all it takes is one honest prayer. "Lord, I can't, but you can." Those simple words move heaven's heart. They calm the chaos inside you. They remind you that even in the darkest night, you have a light that never fades. So when panic rises, don't let it rule you. Stop, breathe, and pray. When your mind spins with worry, lift your eyes higher. Peace isn't found by escaping your problems. It's found by embracing God's presence in the middle of them. The next time fear tries to steal your breath, remember this: prayer gives it back. It fills your lungs with faith and your heart with calm. That's how prayer transforms panic into peace. Not by changing your circumstances first, but by changing you until you can walk through the storm with unshakable stillness. Prayer is not a gentle whisper meant to fill quiet spaces. It is a weapon forged for battle. It is the most powerful tool a believer possesses, yet often the most underestimated. Many treat prayer as a backup plan, something to turn to when everything else fails. But in truth, prayer was never meant to be your last resort. It was meant to be your first line of defense. Every time you pray, you enter the battlefield armed with divine authority. You are not begging for survival, you are declaring victory. Prayer may look calm from the outside, but in the spiritual realm, it shakes foundations, dismantles strongholds, and confuses the enemy's plans. There are battles you will never win by logic, strength, or strategy. The enemy is not impressed by how loud you shout or how hard you work. He only retreats when he hears the sound of prayer backed by faith. When you whisper, "God, help me," heaven takes notice and hell takes cover, because those words carry more power than all the noise of the world combined. That's why prayer is not passive. It's a form of warfare. It's the act of standing between what is and what should be, between heaven's promises and earth's pain, and calling those promises into reality. When you begin to see prayer as a weapon, you stop treating it casually. You don't just say a few words out of habit. You speak with intention. You understand that every time you pray, you're pushing back spiritual resistance. You're breaking chains of fear. You're calling light into places that have long been dark. The enemy wants you to believe prayer doesn't work because he knows it's the one thing that can undo everything he's tried to build against you. He would rather see you complain, worry, or quit than see you pray. Because the moment you start praying, you start fighting from a higher place. Prayer doesn't need volume, it needs belief. The most dangerous believer is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who believes the deepest. You can pray quietly in your room and still cause a storm in hell, because prayer invites God's presence into your situation, and where God shows up, the enemy cannot stay. Every "thank you, Lord" is a shield of gratitude that protects your mind from despair. Every "God, I trust you" becomes a sword that cuts through doubt. Prayer is how you fight battles you can't even see. It's how you bring heaven's order into earthly chaos. But remember, a weapon is only effective when it's used. It doesn't matter how sharp it is if it stays sheathed. Many people have the weapon of prayer, but rarely use it with boldness. They let fear, distraction, or discouragement keep them silent. Yet victory belongs to those who know how to pray even when it hurts, who keep their faith steady when nothing seems to change. Because every persistent prayer builds pressure in the spiritual realm until breakthrough bursts through. You might not see results right away, but every time you pray, you're striking the enemy again and again, wearing down the darkness that surrounds you. Prayer is warfare, yes, but it's also worship. It's not just fighting against something. It's standing with someone. It's acknowledging that you don't have to win on your own because the battle has already been won for you. That realization gives you confidence, courage, and peace. You can step into the fight knowing that you're backed by heaven's armies. You're not swinging in the dark, you're wielding light. So lift your prayers like arrows, steady and sure. Speak them with conviction, knowing they don't vanish into the air. They strike exactly where they're meant to. When you pray, you may not see immediate change, but rest assured, the atmosphere shifts, fear loses its grip, doubt weakens, hope rises. The darkness begins to retreat because it cannot withstand the force of a faithful prayer. Prayer is not a whisper to the wind. It's a declaration of victory to the enemy. It's your weapon. Use it boldly and watch how the light begins to win every single time. Prayer doesn't just change the world around you. It changes the world within you. Too often, people approach prayer as a way to get God to move their mountains, not realizing that sometimes He's using those mountains to move them. When you begin to pray sincerely, something happens deep inside your soul. The weight that once crushed you starts to shift. The fear that held you captive begins to lose its grip. God may not always change your circumstances immediately, but he will always start by changing you, because transformation is his first miracle, and it happens in the secret place where your heart meets his presence. Every prayer is an opportunity for alignment. You come to God burdened, confused, or frustrated, and through prayer, he begins to shape your heart to match his. You may start off asking for one thing, but end up realizing he's doing something greater. Prayer has a way of refining your motives, clarifying your thoughts, and deepening your trust. It doesn't just give you what you want, it gives you what you need. And what you need most is not always a new situation. It's a renewed spirit. When you spend time in prayer, your perspective shifts. You start seeing your problems through God's eyes instead of your fears. You begin to understand that waiting isn't punishment, it's preparation. That delay you hate might be the very space where God is shaping your strength. Prayer teaches patience, because in prayer you learn that God's timing is never wrong, even when it's not what you expected. You stop rushing the process and start trusting the purpose. You begin to realize that peace isn't found when everything goes your way. It's found when you know you're walking with the one who holds your way. Prayer has a quiet power that goes beyond requests and responses. It's the place where your heart softens, your faith matures, and your pride melts away. When you pour your heart out to God, he pours his character into you. He teaches you humility when you want control, gratitude when you want more, and strength when you feel weak. In that exchange, your spirit becomes steadier. The storm might still rage around you, but inside, you stand calm because prayer has built something unshakable in you. Many people pray hoping to change others, but God often begins by changing them. That's the beauty of prayer. It's personal transformation disguised as conversation. Each time you pray, your spiritual roots grow deeper. You become more anchored in faith, less tossed by emotions, more focused on truth. The same things that used to break you start building you because prayer teaches endurance. You learn to rely on grace instead of pressure, on surrender instead of struggle. And here's the mystery: when you change, everything around you begins to change too. Not because the world suddenly got easier, but because you became stronger. Prayer turns frustration into faith and weariness into resilience. It makes you wiser, more compassionate, and more patient. Sometimes the answer isn't a door opening. It's your heart expanding. God knows that a changed situation without a changed person will never last. That's why he works on you before he works on it. So when you pray and the answer doesn't come quickly, don't assume nothing's happening. Something is happening inside you. Your faith is growing. Your perspective is maturing. Your soul is learning peace. That's the hidden miracle of prayer. It's not just about moving God's hand. It's about allowing him to mold your heart. Prayer doesn't make life perfect. It makes you prepared. It doesn't eliminate challenges. It equips you to face them differently. Over time, you realize that the greatest outcome of prayer isn't always what changes around you, but who you've become through it: stronger, gentler, wiser, and more rooted in love. Because when God changes you through prayer, you carry that light into everything you touch. And that light itself becomes the answer to someone else's prayer. Darkness has always tried to invade human life. It creeps into minds through fear, into families through division, and into hearts through despair. But it cannot survive where God's presence dwells. Prayer is the invitation that brings that presence close. Every time you pray, you are not just speaking, you are opening the door for divine light to enter your situation. And the moment his presence steps in, the darkness has to leave. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. It simply retreats. That's the nature of light. Where it shines, darkness loses its place. Prayer is not just communication with God, it's communion with Him. It's when your spirit aligns with His spirit, and that connection fills the room with peace. You may start your prayer feeling burdened and heavy, but as His presence draws near, the atmosphere changes. The same space that felt filled with fear begins to feel holy. The same heart that felt empty becomes full. You begin to sense a stillness that words can't describe. That's not emotion. That's His presence taking over. And where His presence dwells, no darkness can stay. Sometimes we try to fight our battles by logic or willpower, forgetting that we're not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against spiritual darkness. You can't reason with darkness. You have to replace it. You don't fight it by shouting louder. You fight it by inviting the light. That's what prayer does. It calls down the very presence of the one who is light itself. When you pray, you bring divine power into human weakness. You release heavenly authority into earthly situations. Prayer doesn't just brighten your path. It burns through the shadows that try to surround your soul. The enemy loves to create confusion and despair because darkness thrives in confusion. But when you pray, clarity starts to return. God's presence brings order where there was chaos. It replaces fear with faith, anxiety with assurance, and sorrow with strength. That's why it's impossible to pray sincerely and stay the same. When you truly enter the presence of God, something must change. If not your situation, then your spirit. You walk out of prayer carrying light you didn't have before. And that light begins to push back every trace of darkness that tries to follow you. God's presence is not limited by location or circumstance. Whether you pray in a quiet room, a hospital bed, or a storm of uncertainty, He meets you right there. His light isn't dimmed by your struggle. In fact, the darker it gets, the brighter His light shines through prayer. When you begin to pray with faith, you become a vessel of that light. You carry peace into anxious places, hope into hopeless hearts, and truth into spaces that have forgotten it. You become proof that light still wins. And here's the beauty: you don't need perfect words to invite His presence, just an honest heart. God doesn't respond to performance. He responds to surrender. When you simply say, "Lord, I need you here," that's enough to make darkness flee. His presence isn't fragile. It's fierce. It's not a candle flickering in the wind. It's the sunrise that ends the night. Every time you pray, you build a sanctuary wherever you are. It could be your home, your car, your office, or your heart. Once you call on God, that place becomes holy ground. The peace that follows isn't just a feeling, it's a shield. It guards your mind, it steadies your emotions, and it drives away anything that doesn't align with light. So the next time you feel surrounded by fear, confusion, or negativity, don't focus on the darkness. Invite the presence. Don't fight shadows, turn on the light. Because when you pray, you're not just speaking words. You're activating heaven's power in your space. And when heaven's light enters, the darkness has no choice but to go. Prayer is not just what you do in the dark. It's how you drive the dark away.